The envelope was thick, cream-colored, embossed like an invitation. It sat on the kitchen counter between a mug of cold coffee and a photo of Mia from her 8th grade recital. I opened it with my thumb slicing through the seal-like skin. Inside, summons from my parents. My own parents were suing me. The letter blurred, but I kept reading. They wanted $80. Oh. Family legacy fund, it said. A phrase they'd invented when Greg made his second real estate flip and Susan decided to play matriarch. My knees buckled. The stool by the counter steadied me. Its cushion was worn down, same one I sat on through late nights budgeting, dreaming, building. Tom called from the living room. Mia's asking if you want to watch that cooking show. His voice was soft. I couldn't answer. All I saw was Susan's handwriting on the post-it stuck to the letter. This is only fair. Fair, they hadn't invested a cent. Not in my studio. Not in my years waitressing at midnight. Not in the chipped laptop I worked on while Greg got a brand new Mac for business. I folded the paper slowly. My hands were shaking. A drop of ink had smudged on the bottom corner. The smell of printer toner clung to it like the contracts I'd proudly signed with my first real clients. I looked around the kitchen. The backsplash I'd tiled myself. The basil plant Mia watered. The studio logo she designed on a napkin now framed on the fridge. I had built this life. Brick by painful brick. And now they wanted to tear it down, call it theirs. My breath caught. The room was quiet. But inside me, something cracked wide open. I wasn't just being sued, I was being erased. What kind of parent sees their child's success and demands a cut? Would you fight back or let it go to keep the peace? The kettle clicked off. Steam curled toward the window, fogging the glass in lazy swirls. Outside, the neighbor's golden retriever barked once, then settled into snow. I stood still, my hand frozen around the handle. Inside me, a hum was building, slow, low, like something waiting to collapse. The envelope was still on the counter. I'd moved it earlier. Tried to shove it under a stack of mail. But it kept returning to the surface like guilt. The mug I grabbed was chipped at the rim. College thrift store find. Tiny blue flowers dancing along the edge, one of the few things I kept through every apartment, every failure. Green tea. Always green tea on Mondays. My small way of pretending things could be controlled. The floor creaked softly behind me. Tom's voice hushed. You didn't sleep, did you? I shook my head. He stepped closer. His hand brushed the back of my shoulder, resting there. Warmth. Familiar. But nothing about this morning was familiar. The envelope's weight wasn't in grams, it was in betrayal. I don't know how to process this, I whispered. Tom didn't answer. He didn't have to. I sat at the kitchen table, tracing the wood grain with my nail. Mia's backpack lay nearby. One zipper half open, a corner of her art journal poking out. I used to sit here designing mock-ups while she napped on the couch. Back when my studio was just an idea barely held together by post-its and stubbornness. Every step felt uphill. I remember doing client revisions at 3 a.m., one hand on my mouse, the other holding a thermometer under Mia's arm. She'd had the flu. Susan never came by to help, but now they wanted in. Now they claimed they'd supported me emotionally and financially. I laughed, a sound so bitter it scraped my throat. The only financial support I remembered was a $200 grocery loan, followed by 3 months of guilt-laced phone calls asking when I'd pay it back. Tom placed a cup in front of me. You don't have to face this alone, he said. I met his eyes. Something in me was breaking open. Not from shock, but from something deeper. A truth I had avoided for years, that I'd never been enough for them. And now even my success was a threat. I remembered the first time I heard the phrase legacy fund. It was at Greg's third housewarming party. Susan said it over sangria loud enough for everyone in the backyard to hear. She clinked her glass with Frank's and announced, "Our children are part of something bigger now. A family legacy." Everyone clapped, except me. I stood by the buffet table holding Mia's hand and a lukewarm paper plate. Greg's wife got a diamond bracelet that day. I got asked if I'd ever considered getting a real job. I never mentioned it to Tom. But that day stayed with me. Frank never said much. But when he did, it stuck. When I told him I'd gotten my first paying design job, he said, "Huh. Surprised people pay for that kind of thing." Then he changed the subject. Started talking about Greg's new office lease. At Thanksgiving, they'd ask Greg about market trends. Me, I was on mashed potato duty. Even when I launched the studio, Susan didn't call. She forwarded a meme about art majors living in basements with a laughing emoji. I stared at that text for 10 minutes. Not angry. Just hollow. Now she wanted $80,000. For what? For teaching me how to swallow my voice, for showing me how to disappear in a room where I should have belonged. The printer word in the studio. I had forgotten I'd sent something to print. The sound made me flinch. I walked in. The room smelled like ink and warm plastic. My logo design for a local bakery blinked on screen. It had taken me 12 hours to get the lettering just right. The client cried when she saw it. No one had cried for me. Not when I graduated, not when I gave birth, not when I launched my business. Mia padded into the room, her socks mismatched. She held a drawing in one hand, a piece of toast in the other. "Can I put this next to the calendar?" she asked. I nodded. It was a sketch of me at my desk, eyes glowing, a small heart floating above my head. Tears rose suddenly. Not from sadness. From the ache of being seen. I turned away, pretending to sip my tea. But it had already gone cold. I sat down in the swivel chair, pulling a blanket over my lap. The radiator clanked once, then hummed into life. I stared at the wall of pinned mock-ups. Each one had a story. A woman starting over. A business saved. A dream finally spoken aloud. They had trusted me with their beginnings, and I had delivered. So how could my own parents believe I didn't deserve mine? That night I couldn't sleep. Again. I lay on my side, the blanket pulled up to my chin, listening to the slow tick of the hallway clock. The house was silent. Tom's breathing was even. Mia's nightlight cast a soft glow from her room. I stared at the ceiling. But my thoughts kept circling like birds with nowhere to land. What if they really believed they made me? What if this lawsuit wasn't just about money, but a way to drag me back into their story, their control? I reached for my phone. No new messages. Except an email from Greg. Subject line: "You should have known better." No greeting. No signature. Just a screenshot of a group chat with my parents, Greg saying, "She's making us look bad." My hands went cold. The phone slipped slightly in my grip. I set it down like it was hot. So that's what this was. Not justice. Not fairness. Just shame, punishment. For stepping out of line. For becoming something without their permission. The next morning I met Lisa at the diner. It was still early. Snow coated the sidewalks in a thin sheet of ice. The air smelled like syrup and burnt coffee. She slid into the booth, shaking the cold off her scarf. Her hair was damp from the flurries. "I brought the documents," she said, tapping her tote. Her voice was steady, but her eyes searched mine. She was worried. "They're citing a vague verbal promise," she said, flipping open a folder. "And they attached 3 emails from you thanking them for everything you've done." I laughed. It was bitter, broken. "I thanked them for a used couch and some Christmas cards," I said. "That's not a business deal." Lisa nodded. "But they're framing it like it is. Like you made a handshake you didn't realize was binding." I looked around. The diner was half empty. A man stirred cream into his coffee with shaky hands. The cook shouted something in Spanish. But everything around me felt distant. Like I was inside glass. "I feel like a child again," I said, quietly. Like no matter what I build, they still see me as someone who owes them. Lisa reached across the table. Took my hand. Her palm was cold, but her grip was sure. "You're not a child, Ellen," she said. "You're a business owner. A mother. A woman who climbed out of a hole they buried her in." Later, I sat in my studio. No music, no lights. Just the hum of the heater and the creak of old floorboards. I pulled out the folder. Invoices, freelance contracts, pay stubs. Receipts from thrift stores where I bought secondhand desks and chairs. Notes I took in webinars. Sketches on napkins that became real logos. Proof. Not just of my business, but of my becoming. I taped Mia's new drawing beside my monitor. Underneath it, I wrote in pen, "This space is mine," and I meant it. I didn't tell anyone at work. Not yet. There was something about saying it aloud. My parents are suing me that made me feel unhinged. Like I was the problem. So I smiled through Monday's Zoom meeting. I adjusted the lighting. Checked my hair. Pretended the walls weren't closing in. When it ended, I closed the lid on my laptop and just sat. Still, I could hear the hum of the dishwasher. Mia's soft footsteps upstairs. The neighbor's leaf blower whining through the snow. But I felt like I wasn't really in the room. Like I was watching myself live someone else's life. Greg hadn't replied since his one-line email. I wasn't surprised. Greg never confronted, he dismissed. Growing up, he was always the star. State track champion. The one who got the car at 16. The one whose mistakes were just him learning. When I forgot to pick up milk once, Susan grounded me. For a week. When Greg backed the SUV into a mailbox, she laughed. "He's got too much on his mind," she said. I scrolled through old group texts. Susan had changed the group name months ago. From family chat idea to Greg's wedding planning. I hadn't noticed when. Just one more subtle shift in a long list of erasures. That night, I checked my business account, not because I needed to just have it. The balance was solid. I had savings. I had invoices pending. But the fear wasn't about money. It was about being made small again. I closed the tab and opened another. A photo gallery of the studio from the day I finished renovations. The light streaming through the blinds. The clean white walls. The pegboard with neatly organized supplies. In one photo, I stood beside Mia. We were both holding paint rollers. We were laughing. I hadn't remembered laughing that day. Lisa texted any word from their lawyer. I replied, "Not yet. I'm checking in the morning." She sent a thumbs up. Then a second message. "Don't forget you've already won by becoming who you are." I stared at that for a while. Then turned off my phone. The next morning I dropped Mia at school. She waved from the front steps. Her scarf was crooked. Her smile wasn't. I watched her disappear into the brick building. For a second I envied her certainty. Her insulation from the kind of betrayals that don't bleed but bruise. Then I hated myself for thinking that. No mother wants to pass down fear. I drove to the co-op market. Picked up almond milk and berries. A woman at the counter complimented my tote bag. I smiled and thanked her like a normal person. Like someone whose name wasn't currently attached to a civil complaint. At home there was a new email. Subject: deposition timeline. I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead I walked into the living room. Picked up the framed photo of Mia's 4th birthday. She had frosting on her nose. I had dark circles under my eyes. Susan had canceled last minute that year. Greg said he'd try to make it. Neither showed. We blew out candles anyway. That night during dinner Mia asked, "Why do people sue each other if they're family?" Tom froze mid-bite. I looked at her. So direct. So unflinching. I set my fork down. It happens when people think love is the same thing as control. Mia blinked, then slowly nodded. Tom reached over, placed his hand on mine. It was the only sound in the room. Later I found myself standing in the hallway. Looking at the photo wall. There were dozens of pictures: Mia's first tooth, our road trip to Oregon, our wedding. But not one of them included my parents. Not intentionally. It had just happened. I wondered when I stopped asking them to be part of my joy. I sat at my desk, opened the email. It was cold. Unemotional. Facts and dates. A request for financial disclosures. But what I felt was deeper than logistics. It was grief. Grief for the mother I never had. Grief for the father who never truly saw me. Grief for the idea that if I just succeeded enough they'd change. They hadn't. And they wouldn't. I opened a fresh document. Typed the word timeline. If they wanted receipts, I would give them every scrap, every invoice, every bounce check, every client email that said, "Thank you for making me feel seen." If they wanted a fight, they were about to get a woman who no longer needed their permission to exist. The knock came just after noon. 3 sharp taps, not friendly, not hesitant, calculated. I opened the door slowly. Susan stood there in her signature cream wool coat, pearl earrings glinting. She didn't smile. "I thought we could talk," she said. No greeting. No apology. My stomach dropped. But I stepped aside. The living room was warm. A candle flickered on the coffee table, vanilla and bergamot. She didn't comment. She sat on the edge of the couch, legs crossed tightly. I didn't offer tea. She didn't expect it. "I don't want this to get uglier than it has to," she began. I sat across from her, back straight, hands folded. "Then why sue me?" She adjusted a ring. The same ring I used to play with as a child when she tucked me in. "You know this isn't personal." "It's literally only personal." Susan exhaled. "As a family, we made sacrifices for you. Your upbringing, your education." "My education, I took out student loans. You never co-signed anything." She waved a manicured hand. "Support isn't always financial, Ellen. We were there for you. We gave you structure, values." I laughed, short and hollow. "You gave Greg a down payment. You gave me guilt." She stiffened. "You always felt second even when we tried." "No," I said, voice calm. "I always was second." Her eyes narrowed. "So this is about jealousy." My throat tightened. I stood up. "This is about truth." She followed me into the kitchen slowly. Her heels clicked softly on the tile. The envelope still sat on the counter, like it had been waiting. Susan's gaze landed on it. But she didn't flinch. "I told Frank we should have just had the lawyer handle it," she said. "But I thought maybe we could be civil." "Civil?" I turned to her. "You're trying to take from me what you never helped build." Her lips curled. "You wouldn't be who you are without us." Something in me snapped. "Exactly," I said. "I'm who I am because I had to survive you." She went quiet. Really quiet. The kind of silence I used to think meant she was disappointed in me. Now I saw it for what it was: control. "You always had a flair for dramatics," she finally said. "You could have just written a check and kept the peace." I shook my head. "This isn't peace, it's a pattern. And I'm done repeating it." She picked up her purse. "I thought we could settle this like adults." "We are." I expected better. I opened the door. So did I. She walked out without looking back. The smell of her perfume lingered. White gardenia. It used to mean safety. Now it made me nauseous. I stood there, hand on the doorknob, breathing shallow. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just a lawsuit. It was an attempt to rewrite history. To claim my success as part of their narrative. And I wouldn't let them. Later that day, I went through my old email threads. There it was. A forwarded message from Greg to Susan dated 6 months ago. "She's finally making real money. We should make sure it comes back around." Attached below, Susan had written, "I've already drafted a list of what she owes. Let me know what you'd add." I stared at the screen. The heat rose from my chest to my ears. It wasn't just manipulation, it was premeditated. I called Lisa. Her voice was calm but firm. "This helps us. It shows intent." I closed my eyes. Let her words wash over me. "I feel like I'm watching a version of my life I don't recognize," I said. "No," she replied. "You're finally seeing it clearly." That night, I made dinner. Tom chopped garlic while I stirred the sauce. Mia sat at the table coloring quietly. For a moment, everything looked normal. But the air was different. Thicker. Like truth had filled the room and made it heavier. "I saw Grandma today," I said. Mia looked up. Tom paused. "She's not happy with me," I added. But I told her the truth. Tom placed a bowl in front of me. His eyes didn't leave mine. I'm proud of you, he said. Before bed, I stood by the window. Snow was falling again. Soft. Relentless. I opened my journal. Wrote one sentence. They don't own my story, and I meant it. I didn't cry after Susan left. Not that night. Not the next morning. But on Wednesday I broke. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. Just a slow, painful unraveling. It started with a message. Greg. Of course it was Greg. The subject line read just stop. 2 words. Heavy as a hammer. The body of the email was short. This is unnecessary. You know they're just asking for what's fair. Stop being difficult. You're making us look petty. No. Hi. No. Hope you're well. I stared at the screen. My fingers froze on the trackpad. He had said us. As if I wasn't part of that anymore. As if family was something you could be voted out of. I walked into the bathroom, locked the door. The tile was cold beneath my feet. I sat on the edge of the tub and felt my entire chest tighten. It wasn't just Greg's message, it was everything. All the years I bit my tongue. All the times I swallowed hurt to keep the peace. All the Thanksgivings where I sat across from Susan pretending her little jabs didn't leave bruises. All the birthdays they forgot. I bent forward, forehead resting on my knees. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't emotional. But right then I sobbed. Quiet, ugly, exhausted. It wasn't sadness. It was grief. Grief for the version of me that still believed they could change. Tom found me in the bedroom later. I was sitting on the floor holding a photo album. He didn't say anything. He just sat beside me, his hand on mine. That was enough. I flipped through the pages. Greg in high school. Greg at college. Greg with his new baby. There was one photo of me. 18. Wearing my first gallery t-shirt, holding a sketchbook like it was a newborn. Susan had written in the corner "Hobby Girl" with a smiley face. I tore the photo out. Not in anger, just in clarity. That night I called Lisa. I'm done, I said. I don't want to fight anymore. She paused. I get it. But Ellen, not fighting doesn't mean surrendering. It means choosing how to move. I didn't answer. My throat was raw. She added, if you want to walk away, that's okay. But make sure it's from power, not fear. I hung up and sat in the dark. Then Mia's door creaked. She tiptoed in, holding her pillow. Bad dream, she whispered. I lifted the blanket and she curled beside me. Her hand found mine. Small. Steady. You're the strongest person I know, she said, half asleep. I stared at the ceiling. A crack in the paint curved like a question. Maybe I didn't need to be strong. Maybe I just needed to be honest. The next morning I made waffles. From scratch. With cinnamon and too much vanilla. Tom kissed my cheek. Mia danced to music from the living room. For a moment life felt untouched. Until the mail arrived. Another letter. More formal. A deadline for disclosures. I put it on the table and stared. It didn't look like a threat, just a piece of paper. But my hands started shaking anyway. Mia noticed. Mom, I smiled too quickly. Just tired. She didn't believe me, but she didn't push. She went back to dancing. That alone made me breathe easier. That afternoon I took a walk. Snow crunched under my boots. Denver was gray, the kind of gray that sinks into your skin. I passed our old apartment. The one bedroom I used to share with Tom and baby Mia. Where I took freelance calls from the closet so I wouldn't wake her. No one helped us back then. Not Greg, not Susan. Not Frank. We did it all. With coupons, hustle, and caffeine. So why did I still carry this weight? Why did their approval still matter? At a bench by the frozen lake I sat down, pulled out my notebook, and wrote, what do I owe them? Then, underneath what do I owe myself, I stared at the second question longer. Then I wrote, truth, dignity, peace. When I got home, I cleared a drawer in my desk. Labeled a folder receipts of becoming. Inside I placed my first Etsy invoice, a photo of my makeshift desk from year one, a note from my first client, "You made me feel seen," a drawing Mia made last year of me being the boss. It wasn't legal evidence, not all of it, but it was mine. Proof of a life built honestly. That night I didn't cry. I didn't freeze. I didn't feel small. I still didn't know what I would do. But for the first time in days, I knew what I wouldn't. I wouldn't beg to be loved by people who didn't know how. I started waking up before my alarm. 5:30. Sometimes 5. It wasn't nerves anymore. It was clarity. The house was quiet at that hour. Still, just the hum of the fridge and the whisper of heat vents. I moved like muscle memory, journal inbox. Everything in its place, except me. I opened the folder labeled Receipts of Becoming. Held each item longer now. Let them anchor me. Lisa called that morning. "You ready to make this official?" I took a breath. "Let's talk timelines." We met at her office. Not a sleek downtown firm, just a cozy converted bungalow with creaky floors and overstuffed file cabinets. But it felt real. Like something built by grit, not gloss. She handed me a checklist. "I'll need full income records, business expenditures, startup costs, anything that predates the legacy fund idea." I nodded. "I've got most of it." She raised a brow. "You sure?" I looked her dead in the eye. "I've kept everything. Even the notebooks I wrote ideas in while waitressing night shifts." She smiled. "That'll help." The next few days were a blur of sorting. I went through digital folders, tax software drawers I hadn't opened in years. I found a bank receipt with my balance at $13.47. A sketch dated 2019, the original version of my business logo. Sticky notes from late nights. Client needs new mock-up by noon. Don't forget Mia's recital. My life was a mosaic. Messy, yes. But entirely mine. One night I stayed up scanning. Tom brought tea, kissed my forehead. He didn't ask how I was. He knew not to. Mia patted and holding her stuffed raccoon. Still working. Almost done. She sat beside me, small legs swinging. "Do you think Grandma and Grandpa will stop being mad?" I looked at her. Her question wasn't naive, it was careful. "I don't know," I said, "but their anger doesn't decide who we are." The next morning I walked into the bank. Asked for statements from 2018 to 2020. The teller was kind. "Starting a business audit," I smiled faintly. "Something like that." Back home I sorted receipts by year. Printed contracts, even grabbed screenshots of text messages from early clients. Each document reminded me I had done this alone. No inheritance, no handouts. Just persistence. Lisa called again. "We'll schedule your deposition next week. Their lawyer will ask loaded questions, stay calm." I took notes, practiced in the mirror. Resisted the urge to rehearse like it was a performance. This wasn't a show, this was my truth. Susan sent another email. No subject line, just 2 sentences. "You're making a mess of this. Think of the family." I didn't reply. I forwarded it to Lisa. Then I deleted it. One night I dreamed I was drowning. The water wasn't cold, just heavy. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. When I woke I realized I hadn't been drowning. I'd been carried. By hands I didn't trust anymore. And I was finally letting go. I started walking again, just me, the sidewalks, and the sound of snow under my boots. I listened to podcast stories of women reclaiming their lives. One woman said, "Power doesn't come from rage. It comes from direction." I replayed that line 3 times. In the studio I printed my new business cards. Simple, clean. Underneath my name, a single line designed with dignity. It felt right. Mia brought home a school project. They had to interview someone they admired. She chose me. Her paper began. "My mom taught me that silence doesn't mean peace and that kindness can have boundaries." I cried right there in the kitchen, not from pain, from recognition. I emailed Lisa the last batch of documents. She replied, "Perfect. Let's give them everything they asked for, plus what they didn't expect, proof they can't erase you. The night before the deposition, I lit a candle in the studio. Turned off the overheads. Let the soft light flicker against the walls. I breathed in the scent of vanilla and amber. Let it ground me. I opened a blank page in my journal and wrote, I don't need revenge. I need freedom. And I was almost there. The courthouse building looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had just gotten bigger. Not taller, but steadier. Lisa met me on the steps. Her coat was too thin for the weather, but she didn't complain. You ready? As I'll ever be, I said. Inside, the lights buzzed. The kind of low hum that makes your skin itch. The floors smelled like old books and lemon polish. I clutched my folder tighter. Not because I was scared, but because it reminded me I wasn't empty-handed anymore. The deposition took place in a small room. Wood-paneled walls. A pitcher of water no one touched. Their lawyer sat across from me. Sharp suit. Crooked smile. His voice was smooth like he practiced charm more than law. Miss Harper, would you say your parents supported your business emotionally? I looked at him. I'd say they criticized it until it made money. Lisa didn't flinch. He leaned forward. There are several emails where you thanked your parents. Would you call those acknowledgments of debt? I smiled. Number. They were the words of a daughter still trying to be seen. Afterward, Lisa and I sat outside on a bench. She lit a cigarette, offered me one. I declined. But the gesture made me feel older somehow. Equal. You didn't flinch, she said. I've had years of practice. That night I cooked. Real cooking. Sauce from scratch, bread in the oven. Mia danced around the kitchen to a playlist she made. Tom set the table with mismatched plates. It was the kind of night I used to fantasize about when I worked late shifts, a life that felt rooted and mine. Later I opened a new document, titled it My Version. Inside I wrote a letter. Not to the court. Not to the public. To my parents. It wasn't angry, it was true. I told them about the loneliness. The years I stayed quiet to protect Greg's spotlight, the birthdays they forgot, the artwork they dismissed. The little girl who kept drawing anyway. Then I printed it, sealed it, and placed it in a drawer. Not to send, but to remind myself I'd said what mattered without needing applause. The plan came in pieces. First, I asked Lisa if the deposition could be submitted to the court public record. She nodded. If it goes to trial, we can request it. Then I contacted a reporter. Someone I met years ago when I did branding for a local women's shelter. I didn't give her names. I just said, I think there's a bigger story here about legacy control and silence. She listened. Took notes. Didn't promise anything. That was fine. I wasn't chasing headlines. Next, I prepared a slideshow. It wasn't flashy. Just facts. Timeline of my work. Receipts. Photos. I titled it Built from Nothing. It wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. Then came the family dinner. Tom's birthday. Greg would be there. Susan and Frank too. Tom asked, "You sure you want to go?" I looked at him. I'm done hiding. We arrived late. Susan's eyes scanned me up and down. She didn't hug me. Greg smiled like nothing had happened. He joked about real estate, said he might flip a yoga studio next. I sipped my wine. Waited. Then after dessert I stood. I'd like to say something, I said. They all turned. Greg smirked. Frank leaned back in his chair. Susan's pearl earring caught the light. I pulled out my folder, set it on the table. This is the full record of my business from conception to now. Receipts, contracts, timestamps. Susan opened her mouth. I raised a hand. I'm not asking for recognition. I'm stating clearly, I built this. Greg snorted. Okay, Ellen, we get it. You're emotional. I met his eyes. Number, I'm finished being emotional. Now I'm just done being rewritten. The room went still. Tom squeezed my hand under the table. Mia didn't speak. But she smiled. And for once I didn't care how Susan looked at me, because I wasn't performing anymore. I was closing a chapter. That night, I stood in my studio, lit one candle, opened the window. The air was cold, but it smelled clean. I whispered, "You don't get to tell my story anymore." And for the first time, I believed it. The courthouse was quiet. Too quiet, even the air felt pressed down. Like it knew something irreversible was about to happen. Tom drove me. We didn't talk much. His hand rested on my leg the whole way. Steady. Anchored. I wore black slacks, a simple blouse. No jewelry. Except one thing, the small pin Mia made for me. A tiny version of my studio logo. She'd glued it to a safety pin, then smiled like she was giving me armor. I wore it near my heart. Because that's where it belonged. Inside, they were already seated, Susan in navy. Greg beside her scrolling on his phone. Frank in the back pretending not to be involved. They didn't look at me. I didn't look away. The judge entered. Female. Gray streak in her hair. Eyes like steel wrapped in kindness. She called the case. Read the names aloud. My name. Their names. It felt surreal, like hearing your family listed on a police report. Like watching your own name float away from you. The plaintiff's lawyer started. He was smooth, composed. He talked about legacy, family contribution, non-financial investment. I could feel my jaw tighten. Lisa scribbled a note and slid it toward me. Stay calm. Truth wins slow. Then it was our turn. Lisa stood, her voice sharp and low. She outlined my business timeline. Presented my records. Held up my receipts like trophies. Then she asked if I could speak. The judge nodded. I stood. Folder in hand. Palms a little sweaty, but voice steady. My name is Ellen Harper. I started my design studio 5 years ago. Every dollar came from freelance work, waitressing, and savings. I received no investment, no family contributions, no guidance. I opened the folder, pulled out 3 pages. Here are bank statements, pay stubs, thrift receipts, sketches dated years before their legacy fund existed. I paused. Let my breath settle. I was not raised to believe in myself. I was raised to obey. Gasps rippled from the gallery. I didn't care. This lawsuit isn't about money, it's about control. A last attempt to make me small again. I turned to Susan. Greg. Then back to the judge. I built this. I do not owe it to people who only showed up when it started working. Silence. Complete. The kind that makes truth echo longer. The judge leaned forward. Her voice was quiet. This court finds no merit in the plaintiff's claims. Susan flinched. The judge continued. In fact, it appears the defendant acted with integrity, clarity, and independence. The plaintiff's case is dismissed with prejudice. Lisa squeezed my arm. Tom smiled. Greg looked down. Susan. Susan's mouth opened. But nothing came out. For once she had no script. Outside, the air was sharp. The cold bit through my coat, but I felt warm. Whole. Mia ran to me from the steps. Threw her arms around my waist. You won, I nodded. But I didn't say yes. Because it wasn't just about winning. It was about ending. Ending the silence, the gaslighting, the self-doubt. A week later, a letter came. No return address, no salutation. Just one line typed. We regret how things turned out. Signed Susan and Frank. No apology, no ownership. But it didn't matter, because I wasn't waiting anymore. I hung Mia's pin beside my studio door, right above the sign that read Harper and Company. It wasn't just a brand, it was a boundary. A declaration. That this space, this life belonged to me. That evening, I held a small gathering at the community center. A group of young women, all starting businesses. I shared my story. Not the court part. The real part. The fear. The erasure. The long walk back to myself. One woman cried. Another whispered thank you. I nodded. Because I had needed someone like that once too. Later that night, Tom poured me a glass of wine. Mia curled on the couch beside me, her legs draped across mine. The fire cracked. The room was warm and quiet. Not the silence of suppression, the silence of peace. Upstairs, I lit a candle. Vanilla. Soft. Familiar. I opened my journal. Wrote only one sentence. Justice can be quiet. But it is never weak. And I closed the book. Because that chapter finally was done. Spring came late that year. Like it was unsure it would be welcomed. But when it arrived, it stayed. And it was soft. Warm. Like something sacred had finally thawed. I opened the windows in my studio for the first time in months. The air smelled like lilacs. Not the perfumed kind, real dirt under your nails kind. Mia had planted them herself in mismatched clay pots along the sill. She said, "You needed something alive in here." She was right. The space didn't look fancy. The floors still creaked. The rug was secondhand. One corner of the ceiling had water damage that made a shape like a question mark. But it was mine. The shelves were lined with old sketchbooks, some filled, some half-forgotten. Next to them were business cards from women I'd mentored, tied with twine labeled "First Launch Clients." I touched the bundle, closed my eyes. The silence didn't feel empty anymore, it felt earned. That Thursday, I hosted my first design workshop. 7 women came. A nurse starting a handmade soap brand. A single mom who drew animals for greeting cards. A retired teacher exploring candle making. They came with notebooks, nerves, and half-written dreams. I saw parts of myself in all of them. We talked color palettes, copyrights, confidence. One asked, "How do you know when it's time to stop proving and just start living?" I paused. Then said, "When you realize being seen by the wrong people isn't worth staying invisible to yourself." She cried. I did too. After they left, I swept the floor. The room smelled like lavender from someone's hand lotion and cinnamon tea from the thermos someone forgot. I left the whiteboard messy. Wrote in the corner, "You already belong here." Then turned off the lights. That night Lisa texted, "Got another mentee for you. Mid-40s, been through some things. Ready now?" I replied, "Tell her to come." The door's open. Mia turned 15 in May. She wanted grilled cheese sliders and Polaroids strung on fairy lights. We hosted 10 girls in the backyard. Tom manned the grill. I brought out lemonade in glass jars we hadn't used since her 5th birthday. Susan and Frank weren't invited. No fight, no announcement, just a decision. There was no hole where they should have been. Only space for joy. Mia hugged me before blowing out the candles. "I hope I grow up like you," she whispered. I didn't have words. I just kissed her forehead and held her too long. She didn't mind. A week later, I walked past the art store downtown. The same one I used to avoid, too expensive, too professional. This time I went in. The bell chimed above the door. The air smelled like paper and possibility. I bought the nicest sketchbook they had, not because I needed it, but because I could. On the first page I wrote, "This life is real." I built it. And my hands shook. Not from fear, but from reverence. Tom and I took a weekend off. No phones. Just a rented cabin and too much pancake batter. He chopped wood. I sketched by the fire. We didn't speak much. We didn't have to. At night, wrapped in thick blankets, I whispered, I almost lost myself to people who couldn't see me. Tom held my hand under the covers. "You never disappeared," he said. "You just came back sharper." Back home, Mia handed me a gift, wrapped in brown paper and blue yarn. Inside was a thin silver necklace. A small engraved bar. She built herself. No card. Just her handwriting on the back. For my blueprint. I didn't cry right away, not until she hugged me. Tight, unapologetic. That's the thing about legacy. It's not what you leave behind, it's what you pass forward in quiet, solid pieces. Sometimes I still get emails from my parents, cold lines, no apology, no change. But now I don't feel that pull anymore. I don't try to decode silence. I don't answer to stories I no longer belong to. I keep the court documents in a locked drawer. Not as a wound, but as a landmark. A place I crossed and never returned to. Right above that drawer, Mia's pin. The one with my studio logo. Still crooked, still perfect. These days I light candles when I work. Breathe in vanilla and white tea. Sometimes I smile for no reason. I'm not trying to be happy all the time, I'm just present. I wake up and know who I am. That's worth more than approval. More than inheritance. Some women rebuild slowly, in corners, in notebooks, in kitchens after bedtime. This story is for them. For you. If you've ever had to fight for your place, not in the world but in your own life, tell me, what did you have to reclaim just to feel whole again? What part of your story are you still writing? Leave it below. Let someone else see themselves in your words. You are not alone. Every ending can be a new beginning. And justice. It doesn't have to be loud, it just has to be yours. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more true stories of quiet strength, real closure, and empowerment after 40. Your voice matters here.